So, in case you haven't heard, there's been a video floating around by this guy named Fredda, in which he says that alternate history is a form of far-right propaganda. Contradictory, deceptive, and outright biased are some accurate ways of describing this video, and today, because history is kinda what we do around here, we're gonna break down the nonsense.
History is not past events. History isn't even a retelling of past events. History is a story, a narrative. It's written by historians investigating sources, who look at these sources in an attempt to decipher what is the story here. They compile the knowledge gained from these sources and try to extract that story. Two historians working with the exact same sources might come away from them with a completely different read on the situation, due to emphasizing some sources over others or simply asking different questions. Because of this, historians have to be conscious about their biases and motivations as they interrogate historical sources. There's no such thing as a perfectly objective historian. The historian that's most convinced they are objective is the least trustworthy historian. The one conscious of the biases is the one you should trust.
First problem, conflating history and perspective. History itself is those past events, and those events are objective. We know that they happen thanks to not just multiple corroborating primary sources, but tangible evidence of their occurrence. Most times this kind of stuff is obvious. No one is going to argue that the Pilgrims didn't arrive on the Mayflower in America in 1620, or that the stock market didn't crash in 1929. It's only when you get into the realm of debated politics that you get questions of interpretation. Those who don't understand history will argue using oversimplified or only partial details, and that's when you get competing narratives of what did or didn't occur, a truth and a lie, or even a truth and a half-truth, or just a lie and another lie. But there is an objective truth. One side might just not know it, is missing the full picture, or is outright lying. Then you get into issues of subjective perspective, consensus that an event occurred along with all the facts associated with it, but then having differing views on if it was right or wrong or what its nature was because of personal bias. The Muslims were no doubt happy when the Caliphate displaced Rome and Persia, and I don't think that any of the three would disagree that that's what happened. But for the Muslims, this was the rise of their faith. For Eastern Rome, this was the receding power in the Near East, and for Persia, this was the death of their old ancient culture and the birth of a new Islamo-Persian culture. Instead of taking into account the existence of objective truth in history, though with subjective perspectives on those objective truths, Fredda instead passes all of history off as purely subjective and biased, because historic sources can just automatically be dismissed as biased, including those objective truths, which is fundamentally incorrect. Fredda's misunderstanding of objective history and perspective is something we're going to need to keep coming back to as we go on. He then goes on to talk about the Civil War and Christopher Columbus, two highly politicized historical talking points in the modern day, and completely throws out everything he just said. Instead of doing what he previously said and looking at different viewpoints of these topics and treating them as both biased narratives, or doing what real historians do by attempting to discern a true timeline from multiple conflicting sources, he instead provides his own critical interpretation of these events based on the assumption that the narratives he disagrees with are automatically unreliable, suggesting them to be virtual fiction written by biased authors just looking to spin a narrative, while his supposedly aren't. Instead of genuinely investigating the character and honesty of historic sources, this is practically the same as stereotyping them just so you can make assumptions about how to dismiss them.
Much history has been written about the American Civil War, and for a time, in some areas, the prevailing historical narrative was that the US Civil War was fought to safeguard the rights of states to legislate their own policy without interference from the federal government. In some circles, this is still the prevailing narrative. You can arrive at this conclusion if you exclusively rely on sources that seek to emphasize these aspects in propaganda during the war, or in propaganda after the war that sought to rationalize and whitewash the Confederate cause. The accepted historical account, however, is that the American Civil War was sparked by the South seceding in order to protect the economic interests of slave owners.
This is an example of one of those oversimplified narratives. Though yes, slavery did play a role in the start of the Civil War, it's far from the only factor. He says all this while neglecting a wide, several decade-long list of very important factors that contributed to the war, such as the growing social, cultural, and economic divide between the North and the South, instead just pinning the blame solely on slavery, which demonstrates a deep lack of knowledge from someone who shouldn't be speaking on something he clearly doesn't understand. This neglect of major details in the big historic picture, along with general cherry-picking to support his own viewpoint, is something he also continues to do throughout the whole video.
My point being that even if either of these accounts are more correct by the standards of historians in their fields, they're nonetheless neither objective nor factual retelling of events, because none of the historians writing these things were there. They are narratives based on available sources, attempting as much as possible to reach some semblance of historical truth that can never quite be achieved. Because it can never be quite achieved, there's never such a thing as a concrete final narrative of history on any subject. This is the one thing historians have going for them in terms of job security. So now that we've established that history is written from the point of view of a person with biases, relying on a selection of sources written by people with biases, let's get into alternate history.
Here he is again claiming that there's no objective truth when it comes to history, which is absolutely asinine. If I were to make the claim that, in fact, the American Revolution never really happened, and the United States was actually still under the rule of Great Britain, because hey, history is subjective, and the people who wrote the sources that America is independent are obviously biased, right? I would be wrong. Objectively wrong. Obviously this is an extreme example, but it gets the point across that certain interpretations of history are objectively wrong when looking at sources and documents. Again, you have the big picture of history, that is, all the facts relating to an event, person, or time period considered, along with as much connected history that led up to that point. That is your full objective truth. Within objective truth, you do have subjective perspectives, but the facts remain undisputed. Then you have half-truths when not all the details are available, and the view you get is incomplete. Half-truths have holes in them, but holes that can be filled by more research. The sources you find also vary in quality. You might have a dozen different first-hand accounts that describe George Washington as a tall, handsome man, and one source from someone on the other side of the colonies who probably never met Washington, describing him as a short, ugly man who stole from orphans. What can you assume is true? Bad historians love second-hand sources and hearsay that back up their narratives, and it's through this that you get conflicting accounts on objective history, but despite this, there's still only one truth, and honest analysis will reveal that truth.
Alternate history is fiction, but it's fiction that operates on the pretense of being based in some sort of analysis of reality. There's an inciting event or a key turning point, the point of divergence from our timeline into the alternate history timeline. Or more often, in fact, authors work backwards from the reality they want to construct, towards a point where maybe that reality could have become real. An example is Harry Turtledove's Southern Victory, where Turtledove starts with a question: what if the South won the war? And then works back from that and tries to find a way that they could have won. However, the instances in history where the outcomes come down to a single event are few and far between. Usually a particular event's occurrence is contingent on a multitude of passive enabling factors, and then it additionally requires a number of active factors, like the actions of people in the moment. These things intuitively make sense, of course, but it's important to understand how authors of alternate history aren't predicting certain outcomes based on factors in their alternate history timeline. They're instead writing towards those outcomes. Like most authors, they have an idea of where the story needs to go and are working their way towards that, even long before the point of divergence. As an author, they are the master of their reality that they are constructing, and every action and event in this reality flows from their imagination.
No. In some cases, such as the aforementioned Harry Turtledove Southern Victory, they are purely fictitious. These types of alternate history stories use alternate history to build a setting for a totally fictitious narrative-led story, but such is not the case with alternate history as a whole. Alternate history can take two primary forms. On one hand, you have historical fiction, which is what he's describing, in which the author is able to completely shape the world, write characters into existence, and make the world their own, thus allowing the author's biases to seep into the world they're making. it's much more rooted in imagination than reality. The same is not true for speculative history, on the other hand. Speculative history, or realistic alternate history, analyzes the various factors involved in a historic event, along with future events which occurred in relation to the historic event, to propose a theory for how history might have unfolded differently. This is like comparing a totally fictional action game with a historic veneer like Assassin's Creed to a one-to-one simulation of the Battle of Stalingrad.
Here's a video from a channel called Monsieur Z, or Monsieur Z, or Monsieur Z, I don't know. Before I talk more about this guy, Mr. Z, let me play a very short clip from his video. The name of the video is What If the Bay of Pigs invasion succeeded?
For him, encouraged him to step down and ultimately granted recognition to the newly formed government of Fidel Castro. Not realizing Castro carried deeply anti-American sentiments and was becoming increasingly sympathetic to communist ideals. The breaking point came with the warming of Cuban relations with the Soviet Union and the nationalization of American-owned industries within Cuba. Then President Dwight Eisenhower felt that enough was enough and prepared an operation to remove Castro from power.
So what's wrong with this foundational part of his alternate history scenario? Monsieur Z has left out a significant part of the story. Let's lay down the timeline. In 1959, the military dictator Batista was overthrown in a democratic revolution that sought to restore the 1940 constitution, which Batista had annulled after his 1952 coup. In 1959, after the revolution, the new Cuban government began instituting land reform, aimed at democratizing the agrarian economy. One of the ways they did this was by eliminating the ability for small subset of people to own large swaths of land, and instead granted ownership of this land to the workers who had been working it. In so doing, they confiscated a lot of land which was held by foreign companies. This worsened relations between the United States and Cuba, and by April of 1960, the US State Department had formulated a plan to attempt to oust the new Cuban government. In its proposed plan, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs said the following to the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, while acknowledging a majority support for the Cuban government. Oh, and even before that, by the way, in March 1960, the CIA had already begun preparing to overthrow the Cuban government. Anyways, here's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship, and he recommended a policy that would deny money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. In May 1960, Cuba began purchasing arms from the Soviet Union because the US insisted on maintaining its arms embargo on Cuba that had begun under Batista. In July 1960, the US reduced the amount of sugar it was buying from Cuba, so the Soviet Union started buying Cuban sugar instead. In June 1960, the US stopped exporting oil to Cuba, so the Cubans started buying Soviet crude oil. However, Cuba lacked any way to refine the oil, since the US-owned refineries on Cuba refused to refine Soviet oil. So Cuba nationalized the oil refineries without compensation. In response, the US announced an embargo on all trade to Cuba, except for food and medicine. In October 1960, Cuba nationalized most US-owned businesses and property on the island. In January 1961, the United States severed all diplomatic ties to Cuba. And then finally, in April 1961, the CIA trained Cuban exiles, utilizing US B-26 bombers to soften up the beachhead, attempted and failed in their Bay of Pigs invasion. December 1961, Fidel Castro declares himself a Marxist-Leninist and a socialist. The United States has officially shot itself in the foot by pushing Cuba further towards Soviet alignment, when perhaps there was room for peaceful coexistence of Cuban land reform and economic justice in Cuba, and American capitalism in America. So it's clear, Monsieur Z's thesis here is to say Cuba bad because communism, just as I hope it's abundantly clear that my thesis in the previous section was to say post-revolutionary Cuba did a lot of good, and Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union must in part be blamed on strategic missteps by the United States, who could have had a friendly Cuba.
Okay, this is just ridiculous. What he's saying here is that Mr. Z is leaving out important details, and thus his interpretation of post-war Cuba is wrong, despite the fact that his own interpretation left out the most important detail when regarding Cuba's turn to communism, which Mr. Z stated in the very beginning of his video.
Throughout the Cold War, only one other nation stood as much a thorn in the side of the United States as its superpower rival of the Soviet Union. That nation was the small island state of communist Cuba. Of all the countries to fall under communist influence, Cuba was in the most strategically compromising location for the United States, right on its doorstep.
Fredda leaves out this extraordinarily important detail in order to paint a picture of the US just bullying Cuba for no reason, even though Cuba's socialist policies put them at odds with the United States, which it was right next to during the high-stakes Cold War, thus making Cuba a clear and present danger to United States security. He also makes it out to seem like American interventionism was what finally drove Castro against the US, when, in reality, Castro's earliest speeches, prior to him coming out as a communist, had framed America in his eyes as an imperialist oppressor of Cuba. Also, because Fredda seems to suggest that Castro had only become pro-Soviet and a communist because of this, it's worth pointing out that well before his public declaration, Castro had written on the need for a proletariat revolution, and that Cuba's ills were caused by a, quote, dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So, do with that what you will. Not only this, but he also paints an extremely rosy picture of Cuban socialism as well, portraying them as prosperous with only US sanctions hurting them, when this couldn't be further from the truth. Almost seems like he's excluding some important information to support his own worldview.
Now, just to clarify, an author having a bias is usually not a problem. A good author is aware of their biases and message of their work, and those who are consuming the work are also aware of these things. However, in some situations, the author isn't trained to be acutely aware of these things. Or in the worst case scenario, they are, and consciously hiding their motivation behind their work. Monsieur Z is probably both. He makes content that's overtly far-right, and he doesn't seem to have a firm grasp of history. In these situations, what might on the surface seem to be a benign piece of alternate history could be a veiled attempt at propagandizing deeply problematic worldviews or deeply flawed ideas about history.
Fredda's claim that Mr. Z doesn't understand history stems from his own misunderstandings and his own biases, and he uses this as a way to brand Mr. Z and other conservative historians as problematic propagandists, thus elevating his own ideological take on history by proxy. Also, problematic according to who? Fredda is guilty of the exact thing he's wrongly criticizing conservative historians for, which is pushing propaganda and warping history into a narrative that he agrees with. That's not history. That's not politics. That's dishonesty. Because let's be honest here, Fredda doesn't care about history. If he did, he would actually study these things before he talks about them. So instead, all you have is someone looking to push their worldview and mooching off bigger names for attention. Also, you have 3 channels in your thumbnail, but only talked about Mr. Z. What did he mean by this? I hope you guys enjoyed hearing my thoughts on this matter, and if you want to take a look at some more of my content, feel free. And hey, maybe you could subscribe or something. Well, till next time, see ya.